There she is. Ilishnish's trepidation was an odd sensation, a thought with the shadow of her draconic reaction conveyed through their bond. Ludmilla was neither a dragon, nor was she any longer a living being, so her companion's emotions could not be appreciated in their entirety. The fact that she was not human rarely entered her awareness as she went about her daily life. She experienced the world as one perfectly capable of experiencing the full range of human sensations and emotions. The fact that formerly unavoidable human needs had become optional felt like a convenience rather than a cause for concern. When stressful situations arose, however, her new reality became abundantly clear. She was an existence divided between her human self and a physical form constituted out of raw negative energy. Ludmilla Zaradnik was no longer a being of flesh, she was will made manifest. It was commonly said that the undead were immune to fear, but she now saw this common knowledge as a product of imperfect understanding. She could experience fear, but fear could not forcefully impose its influence upon her body. Freezing in fright, fleeing in panic, the flight of rationality in the face of instinct, behaviors of living things that fought for survival no longer held dominion over her. The reactions of the living were now conscious choices rather than helpless subservience to one's base nature. She could enjoy food, yet she could not be driven by hunger. She could experience joy, but euphoria could not cloud her mind. Through fury and fervor, grief and doubt, her thoughts remained crystal clear no matter what happened to her body as long as she willed it so. The only known exception to this was her behavior around the Sorcerer King, but she couldn't say that she was unhappy about that. Ludmilla peered in the direction that Ilishnish's thoughts indicated, unable to distinguish anything against the vast expanse of verdant canopy. I don't see her yet. Ilishnish banked slightly, altering her course. There were supposedly several flights of the Imperial Air Service below them as well, but, as with the approaching dragon, they were too far for Ludmilla to make out against the terrain. How long until she arrives? A bit over 5 minutes. Aren't we too high up to do anything? I won't be able to see what's going on below. Our current rate of descent is fine. If this green dragon doesn't plan on plunging into the ground like a giant javelin, she will have to slow down. Given how the convoy is being moved by zombies and won't get anywhere soon, she'll take her time to examine the situation from above. The mindset of an immortal being. As a formerly mortal being, Ludmilla still struggled to wrap her head around it. Risks she believed were normal became unacceptable. Plans were formed out of calculations that worked out over years, decades, centuries or even longer. The activities of short-lived races happened in the relative blink of an eye and were considered reckless and short-sighted. On a conceptual level, some aspects were rather simple. Dying was not conducive to living forever, so one minimized risks that threatened to shorten their limitless lifespan. If something wasn't safely doable, one could check back later when the situation had changed. Powerful mortals would grow old and die, nature could slowly recover and, in the case of a dragon, with age came strength. Other aspects were problematic or even irreconcilable with mortal thinking. A dragon, for instance, slowly shaped their domains over the course of centuries or even longer. Human pioneers who invested their relatively short lives building a small community in what they considered an unclaimed frontier might be attacked because the local dragon decided that their development wasn't in line with the vision that they had for their domain. To the humans who were wiped out, it would seem an unprovoked, prideful and evil act of selfish aggression that dragons were often characterized by in lore. The dragon would feel no more obliged to explain itself than the humans had felt the need to ask for permission to settle and develop the lands around them. That being said, a dragon's slow, methodical outlook on life had some glaringly exploitable flaws. Broadly speaking, they were naturally vulnerable to situations where time was limited. The more limited it became, the more they tended to rely on their instincts and natural strength. Since that strength could be challenged by few, if any, dragons rarely decided to go out of their way to develop themselves as mortals would. And, so, they had come up with a plan. You should be able to see her now. 4 kilometers below us. Ludmilla leaned forward to look over the side of Ilishnish's neck. A furrow formed on her brow when she finally spotted their adversary. She doesn't look like you. Huh? She looks like a goose in flight. With a long tail. She looks like a green dragon in flight. And why would she look like me? As the Viridian Dragon Lord banked over the edge of the blister, Ilishnish accelerated her descent. There were several distinct differences between the proportions of a frost dragon and a green dragon. Ilishnish was roughly 10 meters long. Her head and neck took up 230 centimeters of that length, her body was 420 centimeters long and her tail was 360 centimeters. Her wingspan was as wide as she was long and she weighed about 900 kilograms. When on all fours, she stood about as tall as a Death Knight. As she advanced into her adult stage and beyond, her short neck would retain the same proportions relative to her body, but her tail would grow longer. Since dragons grew throughout their lives, Ludmilla wondered how large her companion would eventually become. Kalistran, Ilishnish's mother, was nearly 20 meters long while Olisardak, the White Dragon Lord, was an ancient frost dragon who was reportedly a few meters longer than Kalistran. The green dragon below them had a tail that was the same length as her body. However, her head and neck together were longer than her tail. Her wingspan was wider than she was long, so, to Ludmilla, she looked as she had described her, a goose with a long tail. A green one. I'm just used to seeing frost dragons, I guess. That's silly. Why would we be the same? We're not even the same species. If you're going to be discriminatory, at least use something sensible. Like color. As the Viridian Dragon Lords circled below, they continued to circle above. Ilishnish closed within a kilometer of the ground. Aren't we getting a bit too close now? What if she has job class levels with detection skills? I doubt that will be the case. If she does have them, it wouldn't be enough to matter. How did you arrive at that conclusion? A relative sense of strength between my mother, my father and this screen. Additionally, there's the size of her domain. It covers roughly a quarter of the empire, making it slightly larger than my father's. That means she is more powerful than my father, but not by a huge margin. This domain thing, is it going to be a problem in the future? How large is yours? About the size of the territory that you granted me. I thought you did that on purpose. It was a coincidence, or maybe it was a product of intuition that I never realized until now. Are you going to need a bigger territory in the future? I'll take as much territory as I can get, of course. That being said, dragons only really care about the domains of who we consider competitors. This also applies to dragons of different species. A frost dragon will only really care about the domains of other frost dragons. Crystal dragons also share the same frozen habitats, but our relationship with them is a bit complex and there aren't any around here anyway. Additionally, since you are a warden, I trust that you will do what you can to uphold the world's balance in your territory. What about the rest of the frost dragons? They're still getting used to life in the Sorceress Kingdom. A dragon won't establish their domain until they're comfortable with settling in a certain place. In the eventual case that they do, we were all brought up in each other's personal space, so you could say that we're accustomed to being around everyone else if necessary. Out of curiosity, is establishing a domain one of the reasons why you decided to become my companion? Of course. Nothing is ever for a single reason, everything is interconnected and cannot exist without everything else. A dragon wouldn't willingly become a pet just because they like someone. Below them, the Viridian Dragon Lord finally landed, blowing away dozens of zombies at the head of the column. They were gliding 500 meters above, but her roar sounded clearly over the wind. Thieves! You dare take what is mine? Ludmilla looked from the ancient green to where her undead forces were positioned. The Dragon Lord was far from where she needed to be. She issued an order to her Death Knights. Send the regular zombies in. Keep the squire zombies in reserve. Let's see how cautious she is. Containers of treasure fell to the ground as the zombies advanced. The dragon backed away. Why is she doing that? Do you know how annoying it would be to pick up everything if she broke those vehicles and containers? There are plenty of fragile things in the treasure, as well. That's unexpectedly pragmatic. Oh, sure. Look at me, I'm a dragon. Rah. Where did you pick that up from? Ilishnish pitched upwards as the Viridian Dragon Lord took wing. She leveled out again when the green dragon stopped to hover in place. The human whelps in the harbor village. They run around in circles with their arms held out, making these little roaring noises. Then they kick over piles of sticks and stones. The anti-dragon propaganda inherent in human culture is vicious. Oh, fireball. A sphere of flame billowed out to consume the zombies, forming a pile in a vain effort to reach her. Ludmilla ordered the Death Knights to pull their remaining forces back, scattering them all around the trees. Rather than pursue them, The green dragon stopped to inspect each wagon along the way. She's really taking her time. Treasure is more important than zombies, after all. Rationally speaking, there's nothing around here that can even come close to challenging her. Then I guess we wait. As their opponents sniffed at the riches abandoned along the trail, her sheer size became apparent with the wagons next to her for comparison. The Viridian Dragon Lord was a bit under 3 times the length of Ilishnish. Dragons were lighter than similarly sized terrestrial animals, but she should still be at least 20 times more massive than Ludmilla's companion. Simply hearing about the might of an ancient dragon paled in comparison to what she saw. She wasn't sure if the death warriors waiting in ambush could survive a single slash of her claws. Ludmilla couldn't even sense how powerful she was, only that she was overwhelming. Never mind any overt display of power, just watching from a distance drove doubt into her mind. The plan increasingly seemed like a foolish gamble built on blind hope and desperation. How many hits can you take from her? How should I know? I fully intend to dodge. So you're confident you can dodge? Probably. She might be strong, but she's not Lady Schultier. You can tell the difference. I can't distinguish anything above Solitas. This green dragon is stronger than my father, somewhere around Miss Alpha? Except for the whole dragon thing. Additionally, size has its advantages and disadvantages. I know you're there, the Viridian Dragon Lord's voice drifted up from the trees. You cannot hide from me. Hi. She's addressing the Death Knights. Oh. I knew that. Ludmilla instructed the Death Knights to form up on the trailer and had the Death Priests continued to hold their positions. The green dragon moved towards them, tail lashing against the trees along the way. Thank you for lining up so neatly. Now, it is time to pay for your crimes. Be ready to heal. Don't get hit twice. The Dragon Lord swatted away a pair of Death Knights, sending them into the trees. The Death Priests healed them as they sailed through the air. Ludmilla watched through her life essence as their health abruptly dropped, then just as abruptly returned. If your defensive skill activated, lie still. Both Death Knights rose to their feet. The attack wasn't as bad as it appeared. Another pair of Death Knights were swatted away. With their adversary in position, Ludmilla turned her gaze towards the Death Warriors hidden behind the dragon. She activated her offensive aura. Get yourselves ready. Death Knights, pull that dragon back further into the trees, keep her distracted. Ludmilla could only pray that the Dragon Lord didn't notice the Death Warriors setting themselves up behind her. She had masked the vibrations coming from their bodies and amassed zombies to fill the air with the odor of rotting corpses. The remainder scattered around the trees would hopefully make the Death Warriors difficult to distinguish as they positioned themselves to attack. The Death Warriors started loading their crossbows. Death Priests, hit her with something flashy. Familiar pillars of flame streaked down onto the green dragon. No change registered in Ludmilla's life essence. Those spells didn't hurt her? All dragons have natural spell resistance proportionate to their power. Those Death Priests are far too weak. She was hoping for at least some damage. At least their adversary did not appear to notice what was going on behind her. Keep at it. Death Knights, see if you can get some damage in. The Death Knights made it all of 3 steps before the Viridian Dragon Lord turned and smashed them away with a single sweep of her tail. Then, she turned on the nearest Death Priest. Get behind the tree. Start putting bolts in her. Even as Ludmilla focused on one Death Priest, another behind the dragon was slapped into the distant undergrowth with the return stroke of her massive tail. Simultaneously, a gouge appeared across the tree that the other Death Priest had barely dove behind in time. How could the warriors from the legends possibly fight this? Their adversary delivered death in every direction at once. Her teeth, her claws, her tail, she didn't even have to look. With the benefit of blindsight, everything within the dragon's reach was under threat. Her wings could crush assailants and cast them away. Scores of zombies and squire zombies were destroyed simply from their gargantuan adversary moving around. Even without her breath weapon and casting no discernible spells, the Viridian Dragon Lord was toying with a force of undead capable of laying waste to dozens of nations. The dragon jerked to a stop as the first of the crossbow bolts whisked through the air and buried itself in her flank. 4 more joined it, forming a neat little line in her side. Keep attacking. Spread out so she can only reach one of you at a time. Use the trees to avoid her. She's big, but they're much bigger. 5 more bolts came in. Even with the incredible offensive power of the Death Warriors combined with her battlefield aura, their target's health barely moved in Ludmilla's life essence. A furious roar shook the air and the Dragon Lord charged. Second group, attack as soon as you're ready. Their adversary ignored the new attacks, twisting its long neck around an ancient trunk to snap at the Death Warrior moving behind it. The others nearby switched to heavier weapons, throwing axes and javelins from beyond their target's reach. The Viridian Dragon Lord drew her head back as the Death Warriors pelted her with their ranged weaponry. Physical attacks were barely doing anything. Death Priests, summon wraiths. If physical attacks weren't doing the trick, maybe incorporeal attacks would. She's trying to leave. Below, their target turned to walk by some of the Death Warriors heading towards the clearing through which Ludmilla had been observing most of the fight. The undead drew their greatswords and scored glancing blows as she passed. Ludmilla called her glaive to hand. We're really doing this? We have to. She hasn't taken nearly enough damage to make an impression. Pain is the only thing I want her to leave with. She ordered her forces to pursue, forming a half-circle behind the green dragon. Ilishnish made one final turn before rolling into a vertical dive. The lush terrain filled Ludmilla's vision as the wind whipped over them. She activated ability boost as the Viridian Dragon Lord dominated her field of view. Their enemy launched herself from the ground. Ilishnish slammed into the base of her neck. The green dragon's head whipped forward and smashed into the jungle floor. Ludmilla was violently pressed into Ilishnish's back before the frost dragon recoiled from her strike, tossing Ludmilla up to land in a heap on the Dragon Lord's back. Well, that was funny. Hurt her while we can. The undead swarmed in. Ludmilla got up from where she had landed on the green dragon's back, looking for a place where they could leave a lasting impression. Even with their target lying prone, the undead were having trouble getting through the Dragon Lord's scales. A guttural noise reverberated from the trees as the Viridian Dragon Lord stirred from the stunning impact. She was taking damage, but it still wasn't enough. Can we freeze one of her wings? Ilishnish turned her head and released a torrent of supercooled breath. Lines of frost webbed over leathery membranes and froze the undergrowth beyond as the Dragon Lord's left wing slowly discolored. A piercing shriek filled the air. The world lurched as their adversary rose to her feet. Do as much as you can to that wing. Are you getting back on? Just go. Ilishnish ran along the extended wing, slashing away as she went before taking flight. The Dragon Lord turned her head towards the departing frost dragon. Ludmilla's glaive split and flashed into the shoulder joint of the damaged wing as she repeatedly employed her strongest martial art. A few seconds later, she was unceremoniously bucked off the dragon's back. Get those wraiths in her face. Insect. UD. The Dragon Lord reared back as 20 wraiths flew up at her head. Ludmilla took a quick inventory of her death knights before jabbing at one of the dragon's rear legs. A shadow crossed over her as the dragon's tail swept in. She was too close to its base to be struck, but 3 death warriors further out were smashed away. Focus on her rear legs. Ilishnish, strafe her with your breath when you can. But there's only one person here that isn't immune to cold. I suppose that's true. Ludmilla was jostled away as a leg shifted into her, smearing her with acrid blood. She was vaguely aware of her right arm, shoulder and ribs being shattered. Teeth snapped in the air as the dragon removed the wraiths in 2s and 3s. Ludmilla added wind stride to her ongoing ability boost to better react to the dragon's movements, then winced as one of her advanced strike arts hurt her. She scaled back her attacks, glancing around while she waited for her regeneration to catch up. Death Priests, summon fresh wraiths once you lose yours. Death Warriors, pull back and switch to ranged attacks, we're going through mana too quickly. Death Knights, stay out of reach once your defensive skill has been expended. Keening wails filled the air as more spectral undead flew in. Ilishnish streaked by, drawing a line of rhyme straight up the Viridian Dragon Lord's back. Ludmilla pressed her own attacks while desperately trying to keep track of everything going on around her. 3 dull clunks sounded in the air as the dragon knocked away a set of death knights with her 4 claws in rapid succession. How long before she breaks? All around them, bushes and smaller trees were uprooted and flattened. The ground was churned into a muddy mess. With her freedom effect, it did not affect Ludmilla, but neither was the ancient green slowed in the slightest. A volley of crossbow bolts whistled over Ludmilla's head. Half of them bounced harmlessly off of the dragon's scales, twirling end over end as they fell around her. The powerful kick of a hind leg was met with Ludmilla's fortress. Even with her equipment, it wasn't enough to stop all of the damage and she was hurled back. Head low, she charged in under the lashing tail. Another frozen assault raked over them. This time, the Viridian Dragon Lord raised her head and spewed a swirling cloud of green gas in Ilishnish's wake, but the Frost Dragon was already well away. She's starting to panic. Ilishnish's exultant declaration resounded in her thoughts. The green dragon lunged forward through the hole left open in their formation. Ludmilla lost her footing as the ground heaved and the tip of the dragon's tail whipped over her head. By the time Ludmilla lifted her face from the mud, their opponent was already at the edge of the blister. Ilishnish swooped in, nipping at the flanks of the Viridian Dragon Lord with one last frozen breath before their fleeing foe vanished into the jungle. "Are you alive? Is that some sort of joke?" Still on her hands and knees in the bloodied mud, Ludmilla waited for her regeneration to restore the damage she had sustained from the Viridian Dragon Lord's retreat. Their gargantuan foe's sudden sprint towards the tree line caused the ground to violently heave, breaking both of her legs. Something told Ludmilla that she could ignore her injuries and stand, but strange worries about healing in a weird way had her wait for the half-minute or so that it took to completely mend. It wasn't meant to be a joke. I heard that you have died several times in the past, but I'm not sure how that feels as your companion. You're technically not living, you know. I'll be fine. Where did that Dragon Lord go? I'm shadowing her right now. As a dragon? No, as a human. It's quite easy to sneak around in here with all this cover. Ludmilla rose to her feet. She fished out a trooper's towel, cleaning away the mess of mud, blood and plant juices smeared over her body. Surveying the damage in the clearing, she took inventory of her forces. A few dozen zombies and squire zombies were scattered around. The death priests were helping the death knights recover. 4 of the death warriors had been destroyed. She let out a long sigh. Why did I send them in? Despite their incredible offensive ability, they were painfully fragile. With the equipment that His Majesty had bestowed upon her, Ludmilla's defensive capabilities were far superior to theirs. If she was continually taking crippling damage in melee, the Death Warriors would have fared far worse. In her single-minded desire to achieve her objective, she had lost 40% of her strongest attackers. Considering that the objective was not to kill the Dragon Lord but to force her into a defensive mindset, she felt like a catastrophic failure as a captain who should have been looking out for their well-being. Unequipping her glaive, she organized the survivors of the fight. A quartet of shadows crossed over the landscape. The beat of feathered wings filled the air as Wing Commander Burke landed nearby with his flight. By the gods, his voice was incredulous, you did it. Ludmilla wiped away her bitter expression, replacing it with a neutral mask before turning around. The short man's blue hair was a sweaty mat from sitting under his helmet, but his eyes were alight with admiration. His wingmates, too, turned awestruck looks at her from their mounts. The real battle begins now, Ludmilla said. Did you inform General Carbane? We updated him when the fight concluded, my lady. The wing commander seemed to collect himself. He's awaiting your confirmation to initiate operations. Do you have people keeping track of that Dragon Lord? Not directly, but she's sending up birds and other flying animals out of the canopy as she moves around. We don't know where her lair is, but her progress is slow. Ludmilla turned her gaze towards the dark undergrowth of the blister. There were 3 general scenarios laid out in the event that her ambush drove the Viridian Dragon Lord away. The first was that she would double back and attack them again while their guard was down. It didn't seem to be happening, else Ilishnish would have brought it to her attention. With her heading deeper into the jungle, the sensible course of action, at least by human reasoning, was that she would head to the nearest tribes for healing. After recovering her injuries, she would either rest and plot their demise or come back out for revenge and to recover her treasure. This was the worst-case scenario, but the Empire's apparent involvement in the attack was non-existent so far and Ludmilla could turn the Second Legion back around if Ilishnish observed it happening. Her companion, however, put forward the most comprehensive case. Due to a green dragon's nature, she would not immediately seek healing out of a desire to maintain an image of strength in the eyes of those under her rule. She would also be extraordinarily suspicious of everything in her injured state. As such, she would return to one of her lairs, using an indirect route, to brood and scheme. How long it would take the Dragon Lord to recover would be dependent on how long it took for her to overcome her insecurities. During that time, The Imperial army was free to act? It sounded absolutely ridiculous to both Ludmilla and General Carbane's staff, but they still made plans to take advantage of things in the event that she was right. We should get as much done as possible, then, Ludmilla said. Let General Carbane know that he's clear to move. Also, inform him that I've lost 4 Death Warriors. Yes, my lady. Wing Commander Burke walked over to speak with his war wizard. Ludmilla eyed the flights gathering above. The 2nd Legion's air wing would be striking at targets on the far end of the jungle while the Legion's divisions swept in from the spill. Hundreds of rangers would be deployed at the van, identifying targets and dealing with lesser threats while the rest of the army and Death Series servitors went after the rest. The aim was to scatter the demi-humans, making it all but impossible for the Viridian Dragon Lord to easily receive healing. Once her support was gone, they would be able to pester her to death. What's our big green friend doing now? Still slinking around. I'm pretty sure I was spot on with my assessment of her behavior. She's zigzagging all over the place and avoiding the demi-human tribes along the way. Can you put those tribes out of commission? Any dragons along the way, too? Out of commission? You don't want me to kill them? The primary goal is to run their healers out of mana, so just bashing them around will do. But eliminate any major threats to the Imperial army that you notice. Only those, though. If you stop to kill every goblin along the way, you'll fall behind our quarry. Oh, make it noisy. Why? So the Dragon Lord can hear it. She's already running scared, let's keep her that way. If she comes looking for you, just evade her and attack elsewhere. The more time she wastes, and the more paranoid she gets, the greater the window of opportunity available to the Imperial army. And Miss Gran calls me evil. A few moments later, a frost dragon's roar filtered through the trees. The wing commander and his men looked up from their conversation nervously. That's my dragon, Ludmilla told them. There are many like her, but, well, no, she's very special. I couldn't believe my eyes when you appeared and struck the Viridian terror out of the blue like that. Is she one of the frost dragons rumored to have become the Sorceress Kingdom's slaves? They are citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom, her tone cooled. Most of them are employees of the Postal Service. That frost dragon is my companion. Your companion? Wing Commander Burke furrowed his brow. Do you mean to say that she is bonded to you, my lady? That's right. The man's eyes widened. Behind him, the 2 other dragoons appeared similarly shocked. You had so many questions about us that does that mean you're a dragoon as well? I don't think one could have survived that opening strike otherwise. I've had no formal training as a dragoon, Ludmilla said, but perhaps I've become something like one through my experiences. The questions I had for you are in earnest, however. I only recently started riding a dragon, after all. Wing Commander Burke appeared to mull over her explanation. After a few moments, he slowly nodded. Most of our dragoons come from martial houses, he said. I've always assumed it was because they were from cavalry traditions, but it's possible for soldiers from other vocations to earn their wings. If that's the case, I hope to be able to learn more from you and your officers. Speaking of which, do they all have command abilities? All dragoons are officers for that reason, yes, the wing commander said. Rather than a commander, we're essentially captains. If squads or companies lose their officers or need additional ones for unconventional formations, we can drop down and shore things up by assuming leadership. I've had to do it more than a few times when patrols have gone sideways. Relief flooded over her, though she maintained her cordial expression. At first, Ludmilla worried over the possibility that she was a dragoon meant she had contaminated her build. Still, she would have to check with Lady Shiltier when it came to the nuances of how job classes fit together. From behind the wing commander, the war wizard cleared his throat. Sir, he said, headquarters just got back to me. The army's on its way. We're clear to begin operations. The riders checked over their mounts. Ludmilla eyed the saddle on the wing commander's griffin, wondering how Elishnish would feel about wearing one. It was difficult to stay mounted while the frost dragon went through violent maneuvers, and she felt that Elishnish was holding back to keep her on, as well. Wing Commander Burke vaulted onto his mount. I guess we better get to it, then. Fight well, Ludmilla said. His face broke into a bold grin. He offered her a traditional imperial salute. We'll give them hell, my lady. Bits of plant material were swept into the air as the dragoons took wing. They ascended in wide circles over the clearing until they were high enough to disappear over the trees to the northwest. Another roar drifted out of the jungle. "How are you doing, Ilishnish?" "I'm roaring as hard as I can roar. These demi-humans are accommodating me with some lovely reactions." "Have you encountered any major threats to the Imperial Army?" "There are all sorts of creatures in here that I've never seen before, so I'm not sure whether they'll be aggressive to humans or not. I did get a couple of juvenile green dragons, though. Are you certain that they can't be negotiated with?" "They can, but it won't result in anything you'd like. If I notice a deviant, however, I'll point them in your direction." Ludmilla returned to the undead contingent patiently waiting near the trail. The Death Series servitors were restored to an undamaged state, while the Death Priests were down to 1/10 of their total mana. With the removal of much of the demi-human leadership and the Viridian Dragon Lord in full retreat, however, the Death Priests would likely be experiencing a net gain as they accompanied the Empire's ground forces. With the mobilization of the Second Legion, the Death Cavaliers conducting exercises would relocate to patrol around their assigned cities. The 5th Division would ride to join the other 4 divisions coming up from the lake. The Death Knights, Death Warriors and Death Priests would be distributed among the army's forces to assist in their sweep of the blister. 2 hours later, the rumble of hooves sounded through the trees. Ludmilla looked to the sky, where the sun was vainly trying to shine through the blanket of grey. Twilight would fall in 6 hours. The Imperial Army had training in night warfare, but, given the cavalry traditions of the Empire's martial nobility, it was probably nowhere near what she was accustomed to. The advancing column spread out over the clearing. Shouts of officers filled the air as they organized their men. Mounted atop a huge black warhorse, Commander Enns rode up to her with the 1st Company acting as his bodyguard. He dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a thump. "Lady Zaradnik," he offered a salute. "I heard you had quite the fight. Now I'm curious how much of it your air wing reported." "From start to finish," the commander replied. "My communications officer had a hard time getting it all down." Squads of dismounted rangers started to pass them by. Most of them gave her a good, long look. The fact that she was wearing her combat equipment had slipped her mind. She resisted the urge to tug her skirts down. "I hope that War Wizard has enough mana left to help his flight," Ludmilla muttered. "You'll be a legend, at this rate," Commander Enns smirked. "I heard that you declined to participate in those crazy duels the captains always get themselves into, but everyone was too polite to voice any speculations. Now, your martial prowess is beyond question." "I still saw a few things I'd like to learn," Ludmilla replied. "Are your men setting up in this clearing?" "Our first forward base, yes. The blister is a treacherous place and those green dragons aren't the only reason. We won't be able to operate effectively in these conditions without encampments to work out of. Well, the Rangers probably can, but not the rest of us." Commander Enns gestured towards the clearing behind him. "We should head over to the headquarters area. The command pavilion should be up soon." Near the center of the clearing, a wide area had already been flattened. Felled trees were being trimmed of branches and added to a rapidly forming palisade. "Your engineers work quickly." "Oh, something like this is a special occasion for them," Commander Enns said. "The only major mobilizations that we've had recently were the annual battles with Riastais, and there's not much work for them to do in the Katza Plains. This place, though, they really get to transform things." The aforementioned command pavilion was already raised by the time they arrived. A few of the commander's aides were preparing a table and several other furnishings. "How far will the army be able to advance today?" Ludmilla asked. "The Rangers are mapping things out as we speak," Commander Enns answered, "so we should have some estimates soon. The divisions will be branching out and setting up encampments every 5 kilometers or so. From those encampments, the companies go out to hit everything discovered in the area. Once we're done, we'll leave behind a garrison and move on to the next position to repeat the process. I know we've worked things out in advance, but I hope the army will be able to remain flexible as the theater develops. I'm certain General Carbine will make sure of that. Also, the clerics are already moaning and groaning about all of the disease and poison they're going to have to deal with. At least they'll moan and groan less about the undead." Commander Enns snorted, pouring out 2 cups of water. "Times change. It's as you said, if the temples can figure out that summoned angels aren't actually messengers of the gods, they should be able to come to grips with summoned undead not being the bane of all life. I wish the rest of the Empire could adopt that stance, Ludmilla said. I'm worried about what I might find when I go over to the 6th Legion. An aide delivered a pile of reports to the table. Lifting one with a furrow on his brow, the commander let out a sigh. What's wrong? Ludmilla asked. It's a casualty report. Casualties already? That was my thought. They're all in this camp. People getting bitten by venomous animals, stung by weird insects or touching strange plants. I can't quite believe it, but there are cases of poisoning as well. If you'll excuse me, my lady, I need to get this sorted out. You too, Harlow? Fuck this place, the veteran sergeant spat. Fuck it with a crooked, rusty spear. Should just burn it all. We won't be here forever, Rangobard said. What's the damage? One snake. No, I don't know what it was. Like a chicken, but with teeth. Found 'em inside a log and one of my men tried to pet one. Thing nipped his fingers before the lot ran off into the trees. You're reporting a nip? It was a nip. Then his whole damn arm swelled up. Rangobard sighed, adding the incident to the casualty report. After taking the man's name, his healer and the treatment, he scratched his temple with his pen. Just being here feels filthy. It was muddy, humid, and it stank. Every second thing was venomous, poisonous or both. Rangobard glanced over towards the aid station, mentally updating the mana reserves of the company's clerics. Group mana management was one of the few officer-related things that mage officers were trained in, but he never imagined that he would be dealing with something like this. There's one other thing. He sighed again, looking back at Sergeant Harlow. Poison, Harlow said. Do Imperial Knights just stick anything in their mouths? Now I'll admit it probably wasn't the best idea, Harlow crossed his arms, but it's good to know what you can eat and what you can't wherever you are. We're going into this hellhole completely dependent on outside supplies. If those supplies are disrupted. The sergeant reached into a belt pouch, placing a cluster of bright red fruit resembling grapes on the table. Roughly half of the berries had been picked off by some idiot. We should have kept some rangers in the camp to identify all this stuff, Rangobard scowled down at the poisonous fruit. Shoulda, coulda, woulda. That's just how it is. Command comes in with their big plan and we work out the little things that they missed. These little things are going to cripple us before we fight a single battle. Rangobard leaned forward to pen out the incident. Which dumbass ate these? Harlow. Rangobard stared across the table at the sergeant. After a long moment, he looked back down at the report. What was the treatment? Cure poison. Lesser restoration. 2 second-tier spells. They were going to be out of mana before they were ready to move. Effects? Tingly. Cleric said something about a paralytic toxin that has progressively detrimental effects on coordination or some such. Rangobard waved Harlow away before heading over to the aid station. The cleric on duty gave him a dirty look. You too, Rangobard? I'm not here for that, Chara. Can you check over these numbers? The auburn-haired woman took the proffered report. Her thin eyebrows drew together in a scowl. I don't see anything wrong with it, she said. Or more like what the hell is wrong with these men? Do Imperial Knights just stick anything into their mouths? I've asked that question 6 times in the last hour. Maybe we should issue them something harmless to chew on. Like wax. Brightly colored candles or something. Candles are expensive, he told her. Swap out when you're at half mana. Hopefully, we'll have something left for healing when we actually do head in. Rangobard went back to his table. To his surprise, Harlow hadn't left. Across from him was a goddess of victory. Commander Enz's words were more apt than he knew. She was as a heroine from fantastic tales, a beautiful warrior who prevailed against creatures of legend. Clad in pure white armor with black and silver trim, Lady Zaradnik was chatting amicably with the sergeant. As Rangobard stared, she turned her gaze towards him. I keep getting looks like that, Officer Aburbad, the young noblewoman said. Enough to make me start searching for a log to crawl into. Rangobard blinked. His mouth clamped shut as he forced his eyes up from her legs. It just so happens that one nearby was recently vacated, Harlow said. Aburbad's just smitten, though. You look good, milady. Thank you, Sergeant, Lady Zaradnik smiled. Everyone just stares, so I was wondering if I had something strangely equipped.
Well, that ain't nice of 'em. You look great, I mean it.
Rango Bart peered at Harlow with a frown. Is there something we can help you with, my lady? Rango Bart asked.
I came by to pick up my attaché, the Baroness answered with a smirk.
Though by the look of things on my way here, you probably have your hands full. Yes, well, come to think of it, you're a ranger, aren't you? I'm not familiar with this terrain, she replied, but I should at least be able to sense the hazards. That would be much appreciated, my lady, Rango Bart nodded. The general should arrive shortly after the stockade is completed, Lady Zaradnik said. So you have me until then. Can you make yourself available by the time we need to leave? Rango Bart handed his reports over to the major working nearby. I am at your service, my lady. He followed Lady Zaradnik out into the area still being prepared for the company. A squad of the 1st Division's engineers was busy at work leveling the ground already cleared of vegetation. Do the Army's engineers help with civilian infrastructure, as well? They're quite impressive. They do, Rango Bart replied. Our winter was paved by the Army, as were the Imperial highways. Who pays for construction and maintenance? They were public works projects organized by the High Nobles about 4 generations ago. Our winter was paid for by the Crown 3 generations ago. Maintenance is still done by our military engineers and is a part of each territory's budget. That must be nice. Riestais couldn't convince most of their nobles to pave their highways. Concerns over security and expense always arose. A pair of majors walked by, reshaping the ground. Holes filled in and rough, uneven terrain became flat and smooth. A group of men followed up to pack the soil and lay tarps over the damp earth. They didn't seem to notice the Baroness, so she must have concealed herself again. Rango Bart was divided between watching her so he didn't lose track or looking away so he wouldn't be seen as gawking. Having a professional, centralized army has many advantages, Rango Bart said. If I understand it correctly, the nobles of Riestais are responsible for their territories, and not having access to something like our engineers is bound to mean that the construction of large-scale public works is inefficient and unreliable. Each noble would have to cobble together labor out of their subjects and hope that the guilds have experts to hire. In the Empire, an administrator can just contract the army. Does the Imperial Army possess sole license for this type of work? No, Rango Bart replied. The guilds exist and their members aren't barred from the same projects, but they just can't compete with the expertise and cost-effectiveness of the Imperial Army. Demand for the work of our engineers is high and the proceeds from completing projects help out with the budget. Who decides which projects get attention first? Generally speaking, the Army favors large projects because we have a lot of manpower and the work means more to the Empire as a whole. Small projects tend to be taken care of by the guilds. If a specific project is deemed a priority by the central administration, they'll direct the army to get it done. Once local administrations figure out things on their end, it's just a matter of submitting a work order. So the locks on the River Eileen, that's what Commander Renz meant by it being a simple matter before? That's right, he nodded. All they require is financing and supply when it comes to construction. Count Enz and the Margrave of Obereileen can easily provide it without needing to wrangle the support of their vassals. Lady Zaradnik moved past the worksite and went over to where the men were clearing away the brush. Captain German stood with a boot on an uprooted tree, looking out over the landscape with a frown. Not the fight you were expecting? The Baroness asked. We had a vague idea that it would happen, my lady, the captain answered, but certainly not to this degree. It's... Captain German turned to address the Baroness, then froze as his eyes fell upon her. Rango Bart cleared his throat. It's something we have a better idea of now, however. The captain looked out towards the trees again. The other divisions will be using their rangers to survey their campsites before sending them out. I suppose we were too eager with ours. Will the 1st Division's companies still be sent in tomorrow? We'll see how things look once we get set up here. Do you need a place for your tent? Commander Renz had his men set it up at the division headquarters, Lady Zaradnik said. General Carbane wanted me on hand for the opening stages of the army's advance. I just came by to pick up Officer Reburbad. There's still some time left so I thought I could help identify some of the hazards out here. The captain nodded. Lady Zaradnik soundlessly disappeared into the bushes. Not going with her? I tried following one of our rangers through the woods once on a patrol, sir, Rangobard replied. It wasn't pretty. I was more a hindrance than a help. Moving with the entire company in this jungle is going to be a mess. I'm not keen on dealing with more of this, either, Captain German said. If it's like this in a clearing, I don't want to know what it's like in there. Dealing with even greater hazards while fighting monsters and demi-human tribes felt like a recipe for disaster. The plan presented in the captain's briefing was essentially adapted from the mock operations conducted in large-scale field exercises. These exercises were held during winter in the cleared fields of the countryside, however, not the jungles of the blister. It seemed like everything was scaled according to broad assumptions of what would be possible. Though one might be led to believe that the opposite was the case, the Imperial Army had never conducted a major campaign after consolidating the Empire's territories. The annual battle with Reistais happened in a predetermined place and was more a relaxed skirmish than a war. Taming the frontier happened in bits and pieces that involved a division at most. If large demi-human incursions occurred, fighting was done in the developed lands of the marches where their opponents were deprived of terrain advantages and the army could use their powerful cavalry. Professional army or not, humans were a race that dwelled in the plains. They were at a disadvantage everywhere else. At least we won't be here for long, Rangobard said. If we succeed, the captain said, we're going to be seeing a lot more of this place over the years. Rangobard furrowed his brow. I can see us pushing the forests back around the outside of the mountains, but in here? Who'd move into this death trap? You can bet that they'll at least try, Captain German told him. It'll be Crown land and some bureaucrat behind his comfy desk in our winter will come up with some crazy scheme to turn it into productive territory. We'll naturally be sent along with the settlers for security. Mucking around in a steaming jungle for the rest of his career was far from the image presented by the Imperial Army's posters. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad once civilization was brought in. 30 minutes later, a formation of hippogriffs circled over the clearing. Lady Zaradnik reappeared, looking no less dazzling than before despite tromping around in the bush. Is that the general's escort? She asked. It should be, my lady, Rangobard answered. He should be arriving with his bodyguard soon. They made their way to the center of the encampment, where a large stockade had been raised. The general's flag flew over the fortification and 100 heavy infantry were organized neatly at the gate. The officer on sentry duty stopped Lady Zaradnik in front of the entrance. Rangobard couldn't decide whether it was suicidal or admirably dutiful to bar the way of someone who had just chased off a dragon lord. Maybe it was both. Baroness Ludmilla Zaradnik with Officer Rangobard Reburbad, here to see General Carbane. The captain looked over his shoulder to another Imperial knight, who turned and walked inside. The knight reappeared with Commander Renz a minute later. You're just in time, my lady, the commander said. The last of the command staff just came in. Lady Zaradnik stopped at her tent before joining them in the general's pavilion in her usual outfit. Aides moved around carrying boxes of documents and setting up dividers to shield the table within from the wind. It appears that Dame Verilyn was right, General Carbane said. According to the reports from our air wing so far, that dragon is still meandering around the jungle. How does the air wing fare with their raids, Your Excellency? They've already hit 24 settlements on the far side, so the day's tally seems promising. Burke will be back with his men once evening falls. Also, we contacted the Sorceress Kingdom. Replacements for the Lost Death Warriors are on their way. Several freshly made maps had already arrived from the Rangers on short-range assignments. The terrain was unlike anything that Rangobard had seen before. Along with the dense undergrowth and rugged terrain, streams, lakes, rivers and swamps were marked everywhere. Are you advancing as planned? Lady Zaradnik asked. No one has come up with a working alternative, the general said. We'll do as much damage as we can before this dragon decides to show her scaly face again. We can only pray that she doesn't come back out too quickly. This first push should be the safest part, Commander Moen said. The 2nd, 3rd and 4th divisions are already a kilometer in and our screens have been very effective. These demi-humans don't know what's hitting them. Will you be operating at night? Only as long as it takes to achieve our Day 1 objectives, General Carbane said. Skirmishes with the tribes have already started, but reports so far indicate that they're not banding together. Since they're isolated from one another, There will be little that they can do when our forces roll over their settlements. Using the transfer of the tribute to gather their leadership for us to eliminate appears to be working perfectly. There has been no effective resistance to our advance. Demi-human lords aren't the only threat, Lady Zaradnik noted. We've been able to scout monsters and such in advance, Commander Levra said. The Rangers mark them for the Death Warriors, while the Death Knights move to support companies when they encounter substantial tribal threats. It's a pretty comfy arrangement, to be honest. So casualties have been low? Combat casualties are low, yes, General Carbane grimaced, but we're still struggling with environmental hazards. Fortunately, the Death Series servitors are saving us mana fighting these tribes, so it roughly balances out. The command staff continued to review the opening results of their assault. Tentative attitudes from the planning phases melted away, replaced by confidence that grew with every report of success. Baroness Zaradnik appeared content to observe the general and his men at work, though her lack of reaction towards anything made Rangobart wonder what she was thinking. A recess was called before dinner and Rangobart went back with Lady Zaradnik to her tent. Taking a seat to rest his weary feet, Rangobart tensed as a magic item was placed on the table and all sound vanished from the outside. Lady Zaradnik let out her hair before sitting on her cot, stretching out her legs. She caught his gaze and held it in hers. I'd like for you to be honest with me about something. What about, my lady? This operation, the discourse between the command staff's members, how did you feel about it? Rangobart frowned, shifting in his seat to more comfortably face the Baroness. Had she taken issue with something? I've not been privy to any command meetings until my assignment as your attaché, my lady, he said, but I didn't feel that anything was amiss. If anything, things seem as ideal as can be expected. Was something the matter? Dame Verilyn recently shared an observation with me, Lady Zaradnik said. Tell me, in the event that we succeed here, what will happen to the blister? Broadly speaking, Rangobart said, it will become a new frontier. As with any frontier, development will, of course, be contingent on economic factors. In time, however, it should be turned to productive use by the Empire. Lady Zaradnik released his gaze to stare at her boots with an unreadable look. I see.